Okay, I think we're going to get started. This commences the second panel, which is involved with the release of 3 new policy proposals from the Hamilton Project. But before we talk a little bit about the strategy paper that the Hamilton Project is releasing today, I just wanted to underscore and echo what Bruce Katz had said. It's been a real joy and pleasure to collaborate, and we've learned a great deal from collaborating with the Metro Group at Brookings, and in fact, this kind of cross-pollination is one of the real great advantages of Brookings. So, as state and local governments put together their budgets for the 2012 fiscal year, most face acute pressures. These pressures are magnified by the constitutional requirement that most state governments must annually balance their budgets, and this means that they face a trade-off between, on the one hand, the immediate needs of families that are in the midst of this Great Recession, trying to provide food and shelter and health care for themselves, and on the other hand, the investments in critical areas like education, infrastructure, health care, and environmental quality that determine our children's well-being. This tension between the present and the future is the reason that we decided to hold this event. In fact, I think this tension is the #1 public policy issue the country faces. We have had 3 decades of stagnation, more than 3 decades of stagnation of wages for many American families. And at the same time, we were confronted with a sea of budget deficits. So trying to find a way to thread the needle between fiscal responsibility and making the investments that can help turn around the stagnation of wages for American families, I think is really at the heart of what the country faces, and in our small way, what we're trying to contribute to at the Hamilton Project. So let me provide a little context for the problems that state and local governments face. This graph, I think, helps to underscore the seriousness of the challenge faced by state and local governments. It projects state and local spending and revenues as a percentage of GDP, assuming that there is no balanced budget requirement, just to show you the magnitude of the decisions that are going to have to be faced. The short-run pressures, which are evident in the current years, largely due to the Great Recession, revenues have plummeted at the same time that demand for key state services have soared. But what's also clear when you look at that graph is that there's long-term fiscal pressures that are beginning to emerge. And those largely come from rising healthcare costs and huge unfunded pension and retiree healthcare liabilities. One thing that I must say I didn't realize this before we began this, is why is this current budget problem for state and local governments so crucial to the future of the country? And I think the reason is one that's often forgotten here in Washington, and that's that state and local governments are literally the nation's first responders. The list of services that they supply range from providing for public safety, streets and sanitation, and key features of the social safety net that provide our most vulnerable citizens with a basic measure of economic security. But while they try to manage the role of first responder, they're also the nation's chief investment officer. And what this graph shows is they're the primary provider of primary education, secondary education, higher education, and infrastructure. So 90% of government spending on K-12 spending comes from state and local governments. 70% of higher education spending comes from state and local governments, and 70% of infrastructure spending comes from state and local governments. And these are the very investments that provide our children with the skills necessary to compete in the increasingly competitive global economy. In previous and future work, the Hamilton Project has focused on ways to improve the educational system, and today we're going to try and shine a light on infrastructure. And I think it's probably worth, if you could choose a single word to describe the current functioning of the infrastructure system, I think it might be underperforming. There are acute public safety concerns about aging and deficient infrastructure. Many critical infrastructure systems, including highways, bridges, dams, and waterways, were built to last 50 years, but they're now operating well past that 50-year limit. Furthermore, the number of highway fatalities remains stubbornly high. More than 30,000 people per year die in auto accidents. In some way, it seems logical to conclude that that's related to the condition of the roads. As this graph highlights, congestion is another important issue. The economic costs of congestion have risen from about $20 billion in the 1980s to more than $120 billion per year today. And so what we've tried to do is to put forward what we think are not terribly controversial sounding principles for how to reform the system of infrastructure, but actually ones that are not always implemented on a day-to-day kind of grinded out basis. And so the first is we must prioritize investments in the future. So the investments decisions that we make today are going to affect American wages and productivity going forward. And just to put it plainly, as states face these current budget deficits, they must keep in mind the next generation. The second is we must use existing resources more efficiently. This can be done in several ways, as one of the papers we'll talk about shows. Maintenance often has higher returns than new construction. The adoption of new technologies can reduce congestion, and appropriate pricing, like congestion pricing, can also ensure that infrastructure is efficiently used. The third, and it came out a little bit in the previous panel, but it's surprising when you sit down and think about it. But currently, most infrastructure spending is not done on a kind of cost-benefit basis. People don't actually rank the projects as to which ones will work and which ones won't, and then choose the ones that will work. And so some institution of that system, either through the public sector or public-private partnerships, I think is a way forward that could help a great deal. And the fourth is that we must increase transparency and accountability. State and local governments don't always keep the most transparent books, and it's not always easy to figure out how to price their bonds, and that's something we'll talk about later. So I'm very proud to introduce the authors of the papers that we're going to talk about today. They have three very specific policy proposals. Each of these ideas are based on peer-reviewed academic research and have the opportunity, not in kind of a transform the whole world, but in some small way to improve the functioning of government. So the first author is Andrew Ng. He's the Ann F. Kaplan Professor of Business at the Columbia Business School. Edward Engel is the Professor of Economics at Yale University and a Research Associate at the NBR. And Matt Kahn is a professor at the UCLA Institute of the Environment and Sustainability, as well as the Department of Economics and the Department of Public Policy. And finally, we also are fortunate to have with us Tyler Duvall as a discussant for these papers. He's the former Undersecretary of Policy at the Department of Transportation, and he's currently with the McKinsey & Company. And I should add, is one of the most innovative thinkers around about transportation policy. So with that, let's welcome our authors to the stage, and we'll get started. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So if we look at the municipal bond market, this is a market that's essential for funding schools, roads, utilities, public buildings, hospitals, and all sorts of public infrastructure. From the investment side, millions of Americans save and invest using municipal bonds. By any measure, this is a very large and important market. Currently outstanding, there are $2.9 trillion of bonds with $500 billion of new issues every year. Yet, this market is grossly inefficient. Transactions costs on trading in this market are very high. Price adjustment is slow. In fact, price adjustments in muni markets takes days versus minutes in treasuries. Different buyers pay different prices for the same bond, and bonds are overly complex, reducing liquidity. There are over 1.5 million different bonds, and they're extraordinarily complex. Over 60% of these bonds contain very hard to value embedded derivatives. Information in this market is hard to obtain. If you wanted to obtain information on a listed company, you can do that for free from any website. And you can compare that company's finances for long histories with other companies. Now try and do the same for the town that you live in or the school district that you send your kids to. Try and find the interest rate that your school district pays on its bonds, and then see if that interest rate is comparable to the school district across the river. You can't do it. Information is very hard, if not impossible, to obtain in this market for long histories that can be consistently compared across issuers. And thirdly, municipalities pay too much when issuing these bonds. Now you might ask, in a world of small investors with many small issuers, in fact there are over 50,000 municipal issuers, wouldn't this market be naturally illiquid? Well, yes, some of the attributes that make the market illiquid are an unavoidable consequence of the types of issuers and investors in this market. But others are under the control of issuers and can be improved through coordinated actions. So for example, the reason why there are so many different bonds, over 1.5 million bonds, is because issuers issue bonds in series. They take a total amount of money to be raised and then they chop it up. They mince it up into different little bonds. That's not amenable to liquidity. By embedding hard-to-value derivatives, that also makes the bonds more complex and harder to trade. So there are actions that issuers can improve on through coordination. This is a slide that shows just how illiquid these bonds are. One measure of illiquidity is the frequency of trading. Now, I've here taken bonds that actually trade. Over 70% of bonds don't even trade in a given year. So these are excluding bonds that never trade at all. And I've divided them up into 10 buckets ranging from the most illiquid. These trade once every 5 to 6 years. The typical bond trades 1 to 2 times per year. The most liquid bonds, even the most liquid, you can only trade once every 2 to 3 days. This is an extraordinary illiquid market. Now, take the extreme case of a bond that never trades. Would you be willing to pay the same price for that bond as a bond that could be sold close to intrinsic value at short notice? Of course not. What if you needed that money because you have a medical emergency or a natural disaster strikes your house, or you need to liquidate your wealth because you're going through a divorce? Illiquidity and poor information are ultimately borne by issuers in the form of high interest costs. Now, how much does this cost? Well, researchers estimate that the liquidity component of municipal yield spreads relative to treasuries is approximately 1.1%. What does this mean? Well, the average municipal yield is on average about 90 basis points below treasuries. They're tax-advantaged instruments. Now, if municipal yields had the same liquidity as treasuries, they would be on average 2% below treasury yields. Imagine that you could cut 1% off the cost of your municipal interest costs. That's what the illiquidity component is. This is tens of billions of dollars per year. Now, liquidity and access to information are public goods. This is something that everyone can access and utilize, but it's hard for a single issuer to act alone to change the status quo. If an innovator tries to put something in to improve liquidity of information, then if it's successful, all issuers and investors will benefit. But if it fails, then the reputational and financial costs are borne by that innovator alone. It's very hard to do that by yourself. What you need are many people, many issuers, to do the same thing at the same time. And that's our proposal. We propose the creation of a national not-for-profit institution, Common Muni, which is the coordinating mechanism through which municipalities and issuers can band together to share resources. It's designed to improve information and liquidity, set up by private funds and modeled on the Common Fund for college endowments. Originally, the Common Fund for nonprofit organizations was formed in 1971. They had fewer than 100 members out of thousands of endowments. During the 1960s, college endowments were poor, and the creation of the Common Fund helped these endowments to pool together resources for professional management, to get education, and to offer advice and get best practice. Similarly, what we propose here is that a small group, to start with, a small group of issuers would together band their resources, pool them, and come together and improve liquidity and information. It's entirely voluntary. You don't have to use it, but you can. But there's hopefully a virtuous circle will arise that the more municipalities will join, the greater the benefits will be, the lower the interest costs. People will see this, and then it will attract more members. There are 3 aims of this organization. To provide individual issuers with independent advice, a single issuer would find prohibitively expensive. So you can pool together resources to get something that you can afford in common that you alone can't do on your own. Second, to promote the sharing of best practices, information, and benefit from the economies of scale of standardization. And thirdly, to improve liquidity and information quality by helping to coordinate issuers and investors. Thank you.
Public-private partnerships. You hear this a lot. We've heard it in the first session, and different people mean different things. It's become almost a generic concept. So the first thing I want to do is sort of make clear what we understand about for this in this paper. We will take the idea that public-private partnerships are about infrastructure provision, and that it's neither public provision nor privatization, but somewhere in between, which brings us to a topic which is quite ideological. Some people love it because it has the private sector involved more than usual. Others people hate it exactly for the same reason. We will try, and what we attempt to do in this paper is simply provide best practice. The bottom line is, for some types of infrastructure, it can do a great job, for others not, but the details are really important. We have learned a lot from the last 25 years, partly in the US, more in other countries where this has been much more important than the US, but given the numbers we've seen from Michael Greenstone's presentation, there's no doubt that this is going to be more important in the future in the United States. The question is to get it right, and here are some concrete proposals. What is special about a public-private partnership, what makes it different from public provision, is not that it's private firms. Even with public provision, it's private firms doing the building and the like. What makes it different is that the same firm is in charge of building the project and then maintaining and operating it, which means it has incentives during the building phase to take account of life cycle costs, basically to make the sort of investments which will lead to more efficient maintenance. So one of the big advantages, potentially, of public-private partnerships, or PPPs, is better maintenance, something which is badly needed in the United States. It's temporary ownership of the asset. Basically, you have a major upfront investment, you build the project, you operate it, you finance it either through user fees or through some government subsidies or availability payments through taxes, and then it returns to the state. And essentially, the problems you potentially have had, and have had a lot, have been renegotiations, which are very common, and this great uncertainty of demand, which is at the heart of excuses for those renegotiations. To make this concrete, let me go through two examples, one of them close to us here in DC, the other one on the West Coast. First, there were two major projects with private-public partnerships in public-private partnerships during the 90s in the US. One of them was the Dulles Greenway close to the Dulles Airport. This is a 12-mile road. Two independent consulting companies were asked to make projections as to how many cars would show up if they charged a toll of $1.75. Both of them, with the great data they had, projected that you would have 35,000 cars. The moment came, and only 8,500 showed up. So that's 80% less than expected. As you can imagine, they went bankrupt. They had to renegotiate the contract, and you went from a 40-year contract to a 60-year contract. Okay? Not great, because it might have been that the firm that won this was not very good at doing things and sort of was counting on this renegotiation to make the money. In general, renegotiations are not great. Let's now go, why did this happen? It happened because nobody counted on public pressure on improving an alternative road which was for free, but that was part of the risks involved. Maybe inspired by this, when you built in another public-private partnership in California this time, the Orange County Express Lanes, you had a public highway and you built an express lane which was a PPP. Okay? Inspired maybe by what happened in the DC area, they asked for a non-compete clause. We don't want the government to improve things or build another road because that will take traffic away from us and we might end up having to default. And so they did. but things went the opposite direction this time. Demand is very uncertain, and sometimes it's much higher than expected, other times much lower. This time it was much higher. So within a couple of years, you had a lot of congestion even on this toll road, which was charging $11 for a very short ride. What you needed badly was to build an additional lane. But you say, we're sorry, we have this contract here. The U.S. is a serious country. You cannot build this. So it came through the newspapers that for something that had cost a little over $100 million, somehow the state was going to pay close to $300 million. So when it came in the newspaper, they said, sorry, it was a mistake. We didn't mean to do this. Really, next you had 4 years of protracted negotiations, people sitting in traffic jams, waiting for the government to get this right, and they were not able to buy them out till 4 years after, where finally they reached an agreement, and this was bought out. So 4 years of very inefficient traffic in the Orange County area in California. Okay? So again, would have been great to have some way where you can buy out a firm in an easy way. It was not possible at the time. When should you use PPPs? Which are our best practice conclusions from this paper? First, and many of the people in the first panel are going to hate this, but we're sorry, we're just going to say what we believe in. The real reason why PPPs are used in most states and most countries is because it helps in a situation where you have budgetary problems. Definitely, it's viewed as a way where you can do more things now because you get private money. Well, the truth of the matter, just take the simple example of a toll road, but it's also valid if you're going to finance via taxes. It's true. You do more things now, but you give that income which you would have obtained in the future. Okay, so if you have a new toll road and you build it today, the investment is done now by a private firm. Good news, you don't need to spend now, but you're giving up the user fees, the tolls you would have charged had you done it yourself. You do the math correctly and carefully. They're both equally in present value, so beware of that argument. Right reasons. Many or potentially of them. One, it helps screen white elephants. Better than that, the cost-benefit analysis we're hearing from also in this session, but if cost-benefit is not a possibility, this is a second best, and it helps a lot. Of course, it will filter white elephants, it will filter bad ideas, bad projects, only if this is done through user fees. If you finance with taxes, it doesn't help. But with user fees, no firm will show up if it has to finance itself with user fees. Going to what we heard in the first part, there might be some projects there where no firm is going to show up if it really must finance if you don't have very generous subsidies. Second, it avoids charging unrealistically low user fees. The politics, of course, is that you don't want to charge high user fees. We know in the US often you're able to charge something, but then you don't adjust to inflation. After 20 years, that can mean that you're charging way too little. There's been some very nice stories in the US where when you go from public provision to PPP, finally you're able to increase according to accumulated inflation, and that's because firms tell you, well, I'm not going to be in charge of this if you don't assure me that the real value of what I'm going to collect in user fees will maintain itself over time. Still, political pressure comes in, and in one of these examples, which is Indiana Toll Road, it had a great start, but then there was political pressure and said, okay, we'll use shadow fees, which means the government will pay so that people are not too unhappy and the governor has an easier time, I imagine, getting reelected. Finally, and this is the main reason why PPPs are important and they're crucial for the U.S. in the coming decade, it leads to getting better infrastructure at a cheaper price because you have better incentives. It's not the private sector. It is the private sector with better incentives. It's always the private sector infrastructure, but there's a difference between the private sector with poor incentives and the private sector with good incentives. And what these PPPs are about, if you do it correctly for the right type of infrastructure, is providing adequate incentives for the private sector. How then should you do this? Governance. Most states, and I hope this is correct, but when I've looked at it, it's the case, don't separate adequately the agencies in charge of developing projects, of putting together, of awarding projects, and those in charge of enforcing contracts. And there's a tension between those two things. If you want to develop projects, you want to attract firms, you must be nice and you must not be a serious enforcer. If you enforce seriously, they might tell you, well, we won't be coming back. You need both, because if not, you're going to have opportunistic behavior by firms. So you want to separate these two activities within states, and that's one of our proposals. Second, to avoid renegotiations, there should be an independent supervision renegotiations, which sort of is aimed at essentially keeping them neutral in terms of returns to firms so that you have renegotiations where they're really needed and not to have bad faith renegotiations, both from government and from firms. Budgetary accounting, long story, but a simple suggestion is, from the point of view of the budget, public-private partnerships should be counted as public provision. That's a benchmark. You can go into some details around it, but that's the basic benchmark. Finally, designing the contract, and here we have a nice proposal, and it's sort of our concrete contribution to these ideas. Most of the rest I've told you is quite common sense. A big problem, and back to my examples at the beginning with both the Dulles Greenway and the Orange County Express lanes. A big problem with this project is huge demand uncertainty, and the firm cannot do anything about it. Is the economy going to grow at a 2, 3, or 4% in the next 20 years? Do you know? I'd hope some things, but honestly, I don't know either. So what do you do about that? Have them bear this huge risk, which they cannot do anything about? Doesn't make much sense. So why not have a contract design that takes into account these big risks, which means a flexible term contract? If demand is high, basically it's a shorter contract. If demand is low, you have a longer contract. And that's our contribution. It's called a present value of revenue contract. Complicated? No, pretty simple. The following idea. Firms bid on the present value of user fees they want. It costs you $200 million. You want a 20% profit. Your bid, $240 million. It was the best bid. You're going to get $240 million no matter what. And the length of the contract will adjust so that you get those $240 million. Let's go back to the two examples. Dulles Greenway. It's true, only 8,500 cars showed up, not the 35,000. But still, there were enough cars so that that project would eventually be profitable. Had the firm bid its upfront investment and its operation costs, it would eventually made the money. It would have taken more years than it thought, but it would have made the money. No default, no costly renegotiation, no problem, a solution. Another example, Orange County Express lanes. The problem was that the moment this firm and the moment traffic was so high that you realized you needed an extra lane and the firm had a non-compete clause, there was nothing to do. How did you compensate them fairly? With a present value of revenue auction, you ask for $240 million, and you can write in the contract, at any moment, the government can buy you out, pay you whatever you have not cashed in yet, and re-auction again. So if the moment the traffic had grown so much, it was in 1999, you had collected $100 million, the government says, okay, we're sorry, this was a major success, here's your $140 million, we re-auction again, and basically have the new auctioneer pay those $140 and take care of the extra lane. It might be the same firm, but it's again competitive, you get all the advantages, no problem. So present value of revenue auctions help assign risk in a much better way. Does this have important consequences? Here are some large numbers quite generally for this idea. First, PPPs have not been that important in the US until now. I focus on the transport sector in this presentation, and we're talking about $20 billion approximately over the last decade, a little bit more. What do we expect for the future? God knows, or not even God, but basically, you take the growth rate for the last 5 years and extrapolate, and you get big numbers. So it's been growing very fast in the US over the last 5 years. We expect, given the fiscal problems for states, even faster growth in the future. It is easy to come up with projections which are all the way between $50 billion and $100 billion on an annual basis from now till 2020. So we're talking about something which is going to become important, but hopefully let's do it right. It leads to better maintenance, and there are big numbers on the needs for maintenance in the US. The American Society for Civil Engineers talks about more than $2 trillion, whatever numbers you want, it's big numbers. This will help to get better maintenance, more secure infrastructure, and in a sense also a better economy and faster growth. Finally, PVR measures. The reduction in risk leads to a smaller risk premium. Estimates suggest this is at least a 30% reduction. That, again, is a lot of saving because it means that the same investments end up being cheaper because you don't force firms to bear risk they're not in a good position to bear. Thank you very much.
Folks, good morning. We hope that our title becomes a rock and roll song. So I hope we have high hopes in marketing. And all I want to do in my brief time is to market why I'm excited about this project. And I'm hoping you'll read our ambitious paper. We all agree that the transport network is critical to our well-being. But we also know, as our talk this morning focused on, our highways and bridges are not so young. And many of them, as salient disasters have shown, unfortunately, recently, we've got a lot of investment we need to do. The bottom bullet point: we may have a maintenance need of roughly $145 billion. Just a huge amount of maintenance and repair and investment needs to happen. This graph shows you that our interstate was built long ago. And so the way to read this thing is by the year 1972, 80% of our highway system was already built. We built this long ago, and while it served us well, it's depreciating. The same for bridges. I see my beautiful California with green here. We've got some bridges. The bridge to Madison County, many of these bridges need some investment, and we want to preempt and solve our issues before versus to have to suffer disasters and try to clean it up ex post. And so David Levinson and I, in our proposal, advanced 3 proposals to make progress on how to improve our infrastructure system. And some of these are a little bit radical, and we're eager to receive your feedback. Our first proposal is to take the revenue from the federal gasoline tax and to direct it away from new highway construction, and instead to take this revenue and to dedicate it to preserving and reconstructing our existing highways. As the previous slide showed, we've built these highways long ago, and there can be significant economic benefits that we argue in the paper could occur if we redirect this revenue away from new construction towards existing highways where our cities have been built around this infrastructure. Expand it second. We know we're radicals. And we know, even I like a new highway. And so our critics could say, are you academics saying no more highways? No. We want state and localities to have more skin in the game. And so when state and localities identify highways that are good projects, we want to create a federal highway bank where the rules of the game would change. Rather than having steep federal subsidies for projects for building new highways, we imagine and talk at length in our paper about a new set of financing rules. States and localities would approach this new federal highway bank, and they would take out a loan from this bank, and which would have to be repaid. This is old school. And this would create excellent incentives. Because the states would anticipate they have to pay back the loan, they'd have to think about revenue sources, including user fees and road pricing. And this, economists like me love this, of how to marshal incentives to get us to to address congestion issues and to achieve efficiency gains. And so there's a win-win here that we talk about at length. And it's all about changing the rules of the game and incentives. Now, our final policy, rewarded third, performance standards. So while I fear teacher evaluations the last day of class, I understand why we have them. You should see my bimodal ratings. In rewarded third, we formally discuss the introduction of performance standards. And so if a state or locality borrows money from our federal highway bank, and if they achieve certain credible performance standards on several criteria ranging from safety to pollution to speed to equity, we want to reward those states up to the job, and they would be able to borrow at a lower interest rate. So there's pay for performance, there's interest rates for performance under our proposal. And so projects that perform well on these criteria will receive an interest rate reduction, and it is over. And so to summarize, we're radically changing the rules of the game with, we think, a better incentive structure to achieve the goals that we talked about this morning. But we are hard-headed economists for bringing this about. Thank you.
Okay, I wanted to thank the authors for their excellent presentations. And we're going to give Tyler Duvall, who was a high-ranking official in the Department of Transportation, a chance to respond to them. But I wanted to just set up Tyler's remarks kind of in the context of what we try to do at Hamilton. So we found 3 academics, all of whom had ideas, and tried to help them and take their ideas and make them usable in Washington. And as Matt said, maybe it seems like it's radical that bonds should be transparent. Maybe it seems like it's radical that public-private partnerships should be set up in a way so that they can exist and work. And maybe it seems radical that we should only build roads that people want to use. And I wonder if you could help us understand if that really is radical, because I do have these 2 hats, one as an academic and one as the director of the Hamilton Project. And at least with my academic hat on, these don't sound like radical ideas. They sound like ideas we should implement yesterday. So what did you do during the Bush years?
So I guess I'll say the ideas all make perfect sense, and I agree. So let's end the panel. No, so obviously, I mean, the one overarching point about all 3, I think, I would say is surgical, tactical is better at this point in history than sweeping reform. I think given the current environment, frankly, today and for the last 10 years in infrastructure policy in the U.S., sweeping reform has gotten a lot of airtime, but the reality is much more surgical, tactical changes, I think, are far more likely to see support on a bipartisan basis at the federal and state level. Short answer to your question is we pushed a lot of ideas similar to what's been talked about with varying degrees of success, not so much success at the federal level, growing success at the state and local level. And so while there's this kind of pessimism about the federal climate, which is understandable given the current conversation, I think at the state and local level you're seeing seeds of substantial change underway. And I think in 10 or 15 years the climate for reform and infrastructure is going to look a lot different than it is today. So the problem with infrastructure is that the national conversation gets a little too much airtime, state and local conversation gets a little too little. Let me just go from this side, start with the kind of overall highway program paper. My comments about sweeping reform would hold there too. This is a very sweeping reform proposal, but it's actually kind of surgically proposed. I think one of the challenges with what's being proposed is that there's obviously a huge constituency related to new build projects in the U.S. With a lot of influence and power over the discussion. I think generally speaking, a blanket statement that we just want to build, rehab existing facilities versus build new stuff comes into challenge in certain areas. There are a lot of rehabilitation projects that make very little economic sense, and there are a lot of new capacity projects that make a lot of economic sense, and there are a lot of projects that fall in between, which are basically blended rehabilitation, new capital projects. And I think particularly in the larger metro areas, you're going to see a lot of those projects move forward in coming years. So the really great thing about the paper, though, is it highlights this recapitalization challenge, which I think is kind of bubbling beneath the surface of the U.S. Even as we talk about new spending vehicles, new financing vehicles, it's very clear that we are now at a point, an age of the system, that recapitalization is just going to be moved to the forefront based on obvious failures that are going to start to be demonstrated. So I commend you for focusing on that. I do think the Obama administration is starting to focus on that, particularly on the transit side. There's a lot of discussion about, fix it first. That language seems to be seeping into the vernacular. I will say having slogans really matters in infrastructure. The bridge to nowhere was the most powerful slogan ever in infrastructure policy history, so maybe fix it first will come in second. I think the other point, though, is that the recognition that infrastructure resource allocation is a far deeper problem than earmarks. A lot of discussion about earmarks and fixing earmark problems. The reality is cost benefit, and Rob Puentes talked about this earlier, is really not infused at all into the state and local decision process to any great degree. And you look at what other countries around the globe have done for various reasons. They've been able to establish political mechanisms that basically recognize the expertise of big developers and decision makers in this process. And we in the U.S., I think there's this sense that everybody's an expert when it comes to resource allocation, and we've lagged a bit, obviously, in implementing disciplines like cost benefit. Last thing I would say about this paper is that pricing, at the end of the day, continues to be a core problem and is directly related to the resource allocation question. So I would encourage you all to continue to emphasize the fact that the lack of pricing or the mispricing of these assets is producing a lot of the problems associated with the failures you're trying to correct. On the PPP paper, Obviously, we have a huge challenge with PPPs in the U.S. that has not gotten solved. It's one of the most talked about, least implemented ideas probably in U.S. government policy history. We've been talking about it for 10 to 15 years in the U.S. with varying degrees of success. Still, very few states have legislative mechanisms in place to do anything with this. Several, about 5 or 6, have what you call sweeping legislation to allow this, have encountered some of the problems described in the paper. And as was pointed out, you have a classic expectations gap where the private sector comes into a project expecting to have very high returns, very low risk. The public sector expects to dump all the risk on the private sector and have the private sector earn 0 or very low returns. That doesn't really work as an equation, and as a result, we've seen a trickling of projects. 08, 09, and 010 were very slow pace development of these projects, even as these pools of capital around the globe are investing in huge infrastructure projects everywhere else other than the U.S. The one thing I would say is, shared demand risk, as was effectively kind of what you're proposing at some level, in which you basically allow the entity to shift revenue streams out further to recapture revenue, has a lot of merit, and I think we need to experiment with some of these alternative structures. As was pointed out, though, the state kind of programmatic mechanisms to implement these are very weakly developed at this point in history. So what happens is a governor or mayor says, I want to push this project. They go run out, hire financial advisors and other specific project or transaction consultants. They get into the heat of a political battle on that transaction, and then things start to unravel as the economics look weaker and weaker. Developing institutional capacity is a huge weakness in the U.S. It's what every other government that has successfully pursued PPPs has done. We're starting to see the seedlings of that in the U.S., but we're way behind the rest of the world. So we need to experiment. We need to learn a lot more about PPPs, and I commend you for that. On the municipal finance stuff, I think I would simply say that we've got one comment is that there is, I think, a distinction in terms of effectiveness of the municipal finance market when it comes to kind of geo-backed bonds versus project-backed bonds. I think generally speaking, there's a lot of problem understanding what's really going on with the books as the SEC is kind of exploring regularly right now in these municipal and state governments. That's not a new fact. I think clearly adding liquidity to those markets is going to help a lot. One interesting point about what you're proposing is that all of the folks who are proposing infrastructure, bank, or financing vehicles at the federal level have run and will continue to run into resistance from the Treasury Department about the unitary financing that the Treasury Department currently uses, and precisely because of the liquidity, transparency of the Treasury markets, there is concern in various circles of the federal government about the fact that another financing vehicle at the federal level would actually disrupt that mechanism. We have a bit of an expert over here in the corner who may be able to comment on that in the coffee hour. But I think, ironically, there's a proposal at the federal level to create new instruments. There's a proposal at the state and local level to obviously start to collapse these instruments. I think the bottom line is we have a huge municipal finance problem. It is critical to getting these projects done. If you look at leverage ratios today for an infrastructure project versus 05, 06, you were financing a major PPP with 5, 10% equity, 2005, 2006, even using the municipal bond market. Today, obviously, you got to be in the 40 to 60% range to get anything done. So unless we can figure out how to get these credit markets loosened with a lot more transparency and reducing the borrowing costs, we're going to continue to have an infrastructure challenge in the U.S. So.
Thank you very much, Tyler. I thought I would pose a question to each of the authors before we turned it over to the audience. And just going in order, I thought I'd start with Andrew. So Andrew, I was incredibly struck by that graph you have of how infrequently many bonds trade. In several, it seems like a high fraction of them trade only once or twice a year. And then it seems like you went from that to showing that the liquidity premium, so the extra amount of interest that municipal governments have to pay due to that lack of liquidity, is about 110 basis points a year. So that's $30 billion a year. Could you help us understand? It sounds like there's free money laying on the table. Why hasn't that problem been solved?
Well, I think there are several impediments in solving that problem. The first one is that liquidity is a public good. In fact, as an economist, I would call it a positive congestion externality. So what that means is usually when I drive on a freeway and it's rush hour, there's huge traffic jams, and that's because I don't take into account that I'm going to be causing problems on the freeway when I drive right at peak time. That's a negative externality. Liquidity is a positive congestion externality. So usually issuers don't take into account that if I make my security more amenable to liquidity, that not only makes my own security more liquid, and reduces my financing costs. It makes the entire market and all issuers will benefit from that. It's a public good. Now, public goods, like all types of market failure, require some external coordinating mechanism to solve. And at least in our proposal, Common Muni is that mechanism to solve that coordination problem. By yourself, as an issuer, there's no incentive or little incentive to make the security look different from everyone else's. But if everyone or a lot of people got together through Common Muni, at least you're not doing this by yourself. And Common Muni can help facilitate that coordination among issuers. And that's this. So the essential heart of this problem is it's a public good.
And so this infusion of information could be worth $30 billion a year.
Depend on how much you would remove, but I think the costs of starting up this project would be in the tens of millions. The benefits would be potentially in the tens of billions.
Sounds like a good deal. Eduardo, I was struck during your presentation, and I thought back to the first panel when there was all the big discussion about high-speed rail. And, you know, you hear different things about high-speed rail. On the one hand, China is going to soon have a train that goes 600 million miles an hour, and we're in go-karts or something like that here in the United States. And then you see other people say, well, you know, actually there's airplanes that could go just as quickly and maybe they'd be less expensive. And I had this unbelievable idea. Couldn't we use public-private partnerships for high-speed rail? And what would that look like? How would it work?
Well, so the issue would be basically that I doubt that this would get going without some generous subsidies. And what we heard in the first panel was that the former governor was aware of this, and he was talking about some sort of subsidies. And the question is how large those subsidies need to be. So in a sense,
so why would there need to be subsidies?
Because it's unlikely that we have enough demand to finance the cost of these.
I thought that was the point of your proposal, was to help figure out which were the projects that we want to do and which are the ones that we don't want to do.
Oh, I see. So yeah, well, my public-private partnerships work to filter bad projects if there's no government guarantees involved. Because so the first test, which I can tell immediately what will happen, is we come up with a PPP for this high-speed rail, and there's no subsidies. And I can tell you immediately, no firm is going to show up. And next thing you have to do is think about how much you want to subsidize and how you distribute those subsidies across different states.
And there might be legitimate reasons for the subsidies.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
I'm not saying not. But then you're into the question of let's have a cost-benefit analysis of what is the cost involved and what the subsidies involved. And there the public-private partnership advantage is not obvious beyond something I do believe, that with right incentives, firms are more efficient. But it might be that the subsidies are huge, and in a moment where we have limited resources, there might be other projects that are more important. I don't know the numbers, and I don't think the numbers are available based on what you've been saying. But I would like to say the world is full of projects like these which are not done for the right reason too. I mean, it's not only they tell you the projects which are done, they don't tell those that are not done. I'm not saying that we should or should not have it. I'm saying we definitely need much more information of what's involved here. And in that sense, a public-private partnership does not do miracles. It does not. I mean, definitely, if a project does not finance itself, a PPP will require generous subsidies. And then the question is, does that still provide the right incentives? And it will depend on how you do it.
So I can see a common theme developing here, which is that all of these proposals in one way or another want to shed light on the way in which we make infrastructure decisions. And so, Matt, I thought your proposal was in that vein too, and I wondered, one question that I had about the pricing was, you know, is this just like another policy to help rich guys get where they want to go faster? And what are we going to do about the guys who don't have as much money?
So we thought hard on this topic. I am not welcome on these Lexus lanes, and that's and so if the price is currently zero, and if we raise the price, we talk in the paper about several strategies using information technology and other strategies to protect certain income groups. There's also a nerdy empirical literature that people are pretty responsive to prices and are able to change their work schedule. So if we have an on-peak price for driving on the Los Angeles 405, of the flexibility that some people have to rejigger their life to travel off-peak. But David Levinson and I recognize that there will be some people who there could be equity implications of our proposal. And we talk about some strategies of endowing people whose income is below a certain threshold with sort of an easy pass where you have credits to use this road multiple times. And if you don't use those, you can sell those on sort of an eBay exchange. And so we tried to be subtle in our proposal to pursue efficiency and equity. But this is a very legitimate concern with moving away from a price of zero.
Excellent. I wonder if anyone else, any of the authors wanted to comment on each other's papers or ask questions, or we could turn to the floor. Matt, I've known you for a decade. I know you have a question for someone about something. Perhaps not related to this topic, but...
I know we're being videotaped. That's so Eduardo, around the world, so in your detailed presentation, around the world, has any nation really shown its stuff on public partnerships? So do you have a best practice around the world?
I would say the following. We went through a wave of public-private partnerships that began in the late 80s, and we've learned a lot, and a number of countries are going through changing their PPP laws in the right direction. For example, these present value of revenue auctions were not possible in certain legislations, and now they are possible and are being used on a routine basis in at least 2 or 3 countries now. And the question is, why not in more countries? And because it makes renegotiations harder, so firms don't like them. And since firms don't like them, the procuring authority does not like them because they want firms to be happy. But you need a budget crisis to often get things right. So Portugal was an example where they had shadow fees, and there came a moment where they were financing many highways through huge amounts of money from the budget of the Public Works Ministry. At that moment, there was a crisis before the current one, and this was 2004. And at that moment, someone said, you know what, maybe some other idea is better. And at that moment, the lobbies were very weakened because there was no money at all to do anything. And at that moment, they shifted to having flexible term franchises and to base them on user fees, no shadow involved. And they're doing a great job with that. So yes, it takes more time than you think, but it's moving in the right direction. And a number of countries are discussing legislations. One of the advantages of the U.S., and I agree with you, the U.S. has been a latecomer here, but one of the advantages is you don't need to do all the mistakes if you start later. You can sort of skip some of the mistakes and start where others are not. And it's important because often, once you have in place a system which is not working well, changing it is much harder than starting correctly in a sense. And the reason for that is that once you have something in place which is not correct, you have a vested interest which likes the way things are. Whereas you were starting from scratch, often those interests are not that well organized, they're not still part of the system, and therefore you have an easier job to start correctly. I think the U.S. has a great opportunity here.
Michael, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Seizing control. Do deficit challenges create new opportunities? In Washington, will we see more innovative thinking moving forward? So will the economists be listened to a little bit more?
You know, every day we wake up thinking today's the day we're going to be heard. I do think that the current budget pressures make it a little bit more likely. You know, we're certainly going to be trying to advocate for your ideas.
Thank you. That was my real question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, on the PVP front, I mean, I think that the common lesson from the countries that have done it the best is that the people running these programs are dispassionate, not advocates for these projects, that they tend to be from the CFO financial side of the internal mechanisms within the government, the Treasury, and that typically the evaluation, as I said, is not done by people who are actually advocating the projects, but it can be somewhat unbiased. The other big problem, though, with PPPs is you lose a lot of network effects that are potentially possible, particularly in infrastructure and any other network utility. When you start doing project by project, you lose, obviously, the ability to integrate kind of transit and highway policy in specific corridors. You also lose the ability within metropolitan areas, potentially, to kind of produce higher, network effects from shifting demand. Exactly what we see in the railroads, electricity providers, everybody else who is shifting demand over their networks to maximize efficiency without huge capital investments in those sectors. You lose some of that when you have kind of isolated, project-based approach. I think the PPP model could actually expand to provide for some of those network incentives. No one in the world that I've seen has actually tackled that yet. And to your point, the U.S. is actually fertile ground for new thinking on that.
Can I reply to that briefly? You're absolutely right that with networks, PPPs become harder, but still, if you use these flexible type contracts where you can change the user fees in response to changing demand and to network changes, it makes it much easier because basically firms have been guaranteed a certain amount of revenue and present value, and they will care much less about changing the amount of time it takes till getting that than if you have a fixed term contract, which is what's used most of the time.
Right.
So present value of revenue contracts help you also incorporate quite a bit better network externalities into this.
I mean, the other thing that I would actually disagree with, one thing you said, is the fiscal impact. You said that there's not a potential fiscal impact. I do think that governments, with their capital assets broadly, not just infrastructure assets, are somewhat systematically underestimating the true costs of ownership, as you pointed out, for those assets. And clearly, if you're looking at taxes, spending, and capital assets as kind of part of the big equation for fiscal stability, if you could effectively transfer the risk of cost overruns, O&M of these assets, there should be long-term fiscal benefits to doing that, and rating agencies and others should recognize that if the contracts are properly structured. Now, a lot of the contracts are not structured so there's residual liability for the governments in those transactions, but if you can do it correctly and you got good lawyers and advisors, you should be able to see a long-term fiscal benefit from the transaction.
Let me just add anything. We're going to converge halfway in between. I agree if you can really deal with a renegotiation issue. If contracts are renegotiated down the road, it's bad fiscally, it's bad for incentives, you lose a lot of it. If you can deal with that, great, I agree.
Okay, I thought I might turn to some questions from the floor. We seem to have no shortage.
Thank you. Stuart Schwartz with the Coalition for Smarter Growth here in the Washington, D.C. region. I have a Virginia PPP question. They've had the law since 1995. We have a governor with presidential aspirations, and he's about to borrow $3 billion, $1.5 billion into a PPTA trust fund and an infrastructure bank to make low-interest loans to these builders. He now says a road called Route 460 in Southern Virginia is one of his top priorities. It goes between Suffolk and Petersburg, south of the James River. Very little traffic, nothing compared to what we deal with in the metro areas. There's a parallel road that could be upgraded. The Sintra, the only serious applicant, says we need $781 million in public money, we need $491 million in loans, and we'll put up a couple $100 million for about 15% of the project, but thank you for the 75 years worth of toll revenues. I don't see any cost-benefit analysis. I don't see it compared to other things that we need to be doing in the state of Virginia, yet all the authority to make the decision-making is in the governor's office with his Secretary of Transportation. Have you looked at how Virginia's use of this program? Would you be interested in looking at Route 460 as a case study? Thank you.
Okay, so the answer to the second question, obviously yes. I would love to look at it. The answer to the first question, I have not. But let me, based on the information you've given, at least make one comment which I can stand by. The rest, I would love to see it and be in contact with you, which is, it is a bad sign if only one firm is interested. That is something, so if your statement is true, I'm absolutely sure a well-designed project that has gone through all the check and balances you want here should have much more than one firm, 2, 3, or 4 easily. So that would be my first punch, and I'm happy to talk to you afterward and get the details.
Well, let me clarify one thing. There are 2 other applicants, but they are real estate development firms that are arguing that they should be given development rights along the corridor, and they have no track record in public-private road projects. So they're not one of the multinational firms that builds these projects.
Sounds close to one. Yeah.
Okay.
My name is Penny Rostar. I'm with the National Association of Bond Lawyers, and I have a question for Professor Ang. I found your proposal on the Common Muni very interesting, and I have 2 questions related to it. The one aspect that doesn't seem to be mentioned either in your presentation or in the document I have is the role of credit rating agencies in the market for munis, and I'm sort of curious if you... I mean, I'm skeptical, for example, that Chapter 9 really makes a difference in terms of the, pricing of munis, because notwithstanding Meredith Whitney, I don't think there is a lot of, Chapter 9 filings. But the ratings, I would imagine, are noise in one direction. I'm curious if you have no recommendations about them because you think they're a lost cause or there's no problem there. Yeah. And second, your paper does mention the Build America Bond program, but Congress didn't see fit to extend it, and I don't see much change since it's been so deeply mischaracterized. Do you feel that ordinary tax credit programs, that those bonds can be made liquid and low-cost issuances, or are they inherently too difficult to come up with a market for the tax credits?
So let me take those two questions separately. So the first one for credit ratings. I think the credit ratings in the municipal market are as useful as the regular corporate market. And in fact, they're even more, they actually are even more stale and are updated even more infrequently. Some ratings are not even updated after the initial issuance, for example. For the second question, the Build America Bond Program, research has shown that did significantly reduce borrowing costs for municipalities. Absolutely, it did. Now, whether this is actually due to the tax credit design per se, or it's actually due to improvements in the design of the bonds to foster liquidity is a different question. So for example, Build America bonds have larger issue sizes. There is less in-series issue, so there's greater float. There are fewer embedded derivatives. All of those foster liquidity. Right? And there's also the second question about how you design that subsidy. That subsidy was fixed at 35%. One motivation is that's the highest marginal income tax rate. But that is not the amount that the Treasury actually forgoes on the tax collection of these bonds. So I think any future program like the Build America Bond Program would have to be informed by a lot of these issues about liquidity, design, the actual types of subsidy. And then finally, associated with this is that municipal bonds are very special because they're usually held by individuals. So individuals benefit from the income tax exemption. Any market where you expand the number of participants will increase risk-sharing abilities, will in principle reduce borrowing costs for municipalities.
There's a real important nexus, by the way, between PPPs and the healing or improvement of the municipal markets. Obviously, the cost of capital advantage for municipal borrowers is one of the main reasons many have not pursued public-private partnerships in the U.S. No other country in the world has a municipal market the way the United States does. And I think there's an interesting potential collaboration with you two on that. We pushed in the last administration for an exemption called private activity bonds to expand the exempt facility list of the code to allow private infrastructure projects to basically benefit from the same tax-exempt status. That's the reason the Capital Beltway project got financed at some level, and there's 3 or 4 more that have gotten financed under that change. But the more liquidity, ironically, you develop in the municipal markets, the more the argument will be we don't need to use private capital. So just be aware of that tension.
Okay, I think we'll take a final question in the back.
John Nelson with Wall Street Without Walls. I'd like to thank the panel for really an excellent presentation. Bruce Katz has heard this before, so he'll probably roll his eyes, but the whole idea of using debt or underutilized assets as a risk mitigation, as a way of getting new capital, is something that we've recommended. The federal government, for example, has about $10 billion of assets that come into the coffers every year. They sell them off at auction. They hold them in virtual and real warehouses. States have all kinds of illiquid assets that they're holding on their books. Cities have all kinds of vacant lots, et cetera. These could be used as extra collateral to help finance infrastructure and other economic development activities. Well, how much of the city of Detroit is owned by the city of Detroit in terms of the land mass? Let's utilize those underutilized assets as a credit enhancement, as a way of mitigating risk and bringing more money into the infrastructure and economic development sphere. So we're always putting our oar into that water.
Okay.
Structured finance for good.
Thank you for that statement. I wonder if we could take one last question. I think the woman in red there.
Thank you. My name is Lisa Lindsley. I'm from the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees. I wanted to make a comment and ask a question of Professor Eng also. Just following up on the Build America bonds, you know, as someone who worked to restore transparency to the over-the-counter derivatives market, I really applaud your effort, and also caution you that because the bid-ask spreads will narrow, if you're successful, there will be large forces at work to prevent that from happening. But it would be good for both issuers and investors. I do think that, you know, your comments on the Build America bonds were spot on, and the diversification of the investor base that occurred with Build America bonds was important, and that the subsidy could be revenue neutral. It doesn't have to be 35, it could be 28, whatever. And that alone would really improve the liquidity of municipal bonds, because you had sovereign wealth funds and even public pensions who can't buy tax-exempt bonds because they're already tax-exempt. I did want to point out one thing in your paper that I think detracts from the credibility of your ideas, which was your endorsement of the idea that public pension funds, or that state and local governments, are the equivalent of a married couple who has a mortgage. Because, like it or not, we'll always have New Jersey with us. New Jersey can't go bankrupt and get a federal bailout the way a GM could, and it can't resort to the PBGC. It does have taxing authority, so the idea that public pensions need to use the tax-exempt rate to discount their liabilities is really a recipe for less transparency instead of more. Thank you.
So this issue of public accounting is really a large issue of the differences between GASB standards, which are entirely voluntary. There's no penalties for non-compliance with this. In fact, only 26 states require GASB. And the FASB standards, which have differences, and one of major differences, how they account for certain liabilities, in particular pensions. How many people here think that no state has defaulted? Has any state in the U.S. defaulted?
California will.
Okay, so in the past tense, in the history of the U.S., have there only been any? In fact, Arkansas has defaulted 3 times. There have been three areas of default in the U.S. during the 1830s and 40s, in the late 1800s, and Arkansas was the last one in 1933. In fact, Charles Dickens' novel, published in 1834, Ebenezer Scrooge, the guy that, you know, the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future, gets taken through his life. He has a nightmare. Well, he has several nightmares in that book. But one of them is that his wealth is transformed into, quote unquote, a mere United States security. So states have defaulted. They certainly have defaulted. So the issue of public pension accounting, I think, is something way beyond our panel right now. But I think that you want to present your liabilities in the most transparent way possible. And I think we can definitely agree on that point. The difference then is on what that transparency is. Now, in my belief, you want to make that liability as accurately stated as possible. Misstating that doesn't make the liability go away. But I think we are in full agreement that transparency is a really good thing. Our only argument is actually in how to create that particular detail of transparency.
Thank you, Andrew. So I wonder if everyone could join me in thanking Tyler and the 3 authors, who I think all did a great job.